But starting with those foundations, the contracting in counselling, and I'm looking back to level 2, where it was suggested that counselling is a contracted activity.
Yes, and that was a bit of a surprise to me when I started in my counselling course, my introduction course many years ago, because it was something I never ever considered. I thought it was about sitting and listening to people and helping, and I even thought at that time it was about giving advice, which of course counselling isn't. And to find out that you had to actually contract was a bit of an eye opener, and I think it was an eye opener for all my peers who were sat in that circle. And it continues, I think, to be an eye-opener, certainly as I taught, when you speak to students and you say, you have to contract with your client, because I don't think it's something that maybe the layperson really considers. I think if you've had your own therapy, you probably know that there's a contract. And the other thing that I would observe is that when I first went into practice in the 2002, which makes me sound a bit ancient, nobody ever talked about having a written contract. It was all verbal.
Yeah,
it was all verbal. And now, of course, we live in more professional and enlightened times. And of course, now contracts are written, and we have to be really thoughtful about contracts and what they're used for. They have many facets, Ken.
They do. And, I think I love how you've started there, Rory, that it was a surprise to you that there's contracting within a therapeutic environment. And I think it's about frame of reference. How do we view what a contract is before we maybe embark on training? And for me, a contract is something that gets put in place when you owe somebody money, or when you have an agreement of usually linked to some kind of a financial agreement, because contracts that I'd signed prior to coming into counselling were things like if I bought a car, if I bought a house, there would be a contract in place. And that contract would contain something called fine print. And the fine print is basically the terms and conditions of what happens when you don't pay. So like yourself, when I heard the term contract within counselling, within the counselling relationship, that it is a contracted relationship, it was rather surprising. And I had to set aside, I guess, that frame of reference to recognize that a therapeutic contract, it is slightly different. It's not about how much a client has to pay to come to counselling. That may be one line in the contract, but the contract is there in service of the client, in service of the relationship. And it actually creates a circle around the therapeutically held relationship, where the client feels safe and knows exactly what is inside that circle. There's no surprises. Nothing's going to come up where a client's going to go, I didn't know about that, because it should be covered in the contracting stage.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I think what you're alluding to, it speaks to autonomy. When you say the client, doesn't know what's coming up, that means they lack autonomy. They lack an ability to make a thoughtful decision on what they're involved in, which is therapy. And I think that the first thing the contract does, a good contract, and sometimes we might call it a working agreement. Probably that would probably be a better way of describing it, because everybody thinks of contract, mobile phone, buying a house, buying a car, work. Everybody has a contract when they work. So that working agreement, those non-negotiables in it, such as when you break confidentiality, such as when the sessions are offered. If you're a private practitioner charging a fee, such as the fee, that's really, really important. So the client can look at that contract and take a view: is this what I want to get involved with? And I think that as we moved into the online world, that those contracts now are becoming a little bit more intense, because in the room you don't have to think about those variables that you do online, and those variables are the platform you're using. Where we're recording this on Zoom at the moment, so if I work with a client, I have to be sure that the telehealth platform I use is GDPR compliant. GDPR, data protection, that's something that we would talk about now. And also safety contracts. What happens if you're working with someone 200 miles away and they become ill?
Yeah.
So contracting has become a fundamental part of our work, and one that I think needs special attention paying to it. It needs attention.
Yeah. And you also said, as we kind of led into this topic, that when you started your training, it was a lot more common to have a verbal contract in place where you would maybe explain to the client coming in what was going to happen in counselling, where you may need to break confidentiality linked to legislation or a court order requiring your notes, and you'd give them that information. You'd check if they agreed that. They'd say yes, and on you would go. And as you've quite rightly said, Rory, more professional time, but sadly, I guess, more litigious. Is it litigious? I don't know the word. What I'm trying to say here is we live in times where people turn to the law more to sue or to claim damages from people. And having a contract in place gives you a written mutual understanding and agreement of what is on offer and what that looks like, that you can refer back to, that's got a date on it, that's got a signature on it. And most certainly, if you are a qualified therapist, psychotherapist working with clients, and a complaint is laid to a professional body, one of the first documents the professional body would ask for when kind of considering that complaint is the contract. They would want to see the contract or the working agreement. And for that to be valid, there would need to be a signature on it. It's informed consent. You can't say, but I showed this to the client and they agreed to it, because that doesn't indicate informed consent. It needs a signature on and it needs a date on it. Now, are there practices where you might not have a signed contract? Yes. I mean, there are therapists that still work outside of having a signed contract and will work with a verbal contract. And I guess that's about you making the decision for your own practice. And certainly if you're working in a helping relationship, you may go for a verbal contract. But if you look at what a contract is in its basic form, it's a document in place in case things go terribly wrong. Now, you may bring out the contract from time to time to just re-look at the working agreement. But if things go terribly wrong, that is the document you're going to be diving for. And if you don't have a signed contract, it can lead to you not being, as a therapist, fully protected.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I think you alluded to qualified colleagues, but I think if you were a student colleague, and you could have a complaint levied against you, they are few and far between. And I have to say, before anybody gets really worried about litigation, I think litigation is in this country quite unusual, but it would be more to support the basis of a complaint. And ethical bodies, if there was a complaint regarding maybe fees, breaking confidentiality, amount of sessions offered, the first thing they'd ask for would be a contract. Well, let's have a look at the contract the client's had. And, if you haven't got one, I think you might find yourself in a bit of difficulty. But as Ken said, we're not here to preach to people. People make their own minds up. And of course, there are, we sometimes talk about contracts as the business end, but there are, in some therapies, therapy contracts where you might contract with someone if you're a CBT therapist for them to do homework. I had a friend of mine who did some TA therapy, who was a client, and they had to contract not to go mad. And apparently this is something that TA therapists sometimes contract for.
Yes.
I don't know, it was a good few years ago. I don't know if it's the case now, but, to try and manage that cycle of that enormity of change that might happen through the arc of therapy. So there are different contracts. But, I think, I don't know about you, Ken, but the online world has certainly brought contracting more into focus.
I think it has. And when we're speaking about having that informed consent working online, it can be a little bit more tricky because you're not physically in a room where you may hand somebody a pen and say, can you sign and date that for me? And of course, there are online platforms you can use, DocuSign, and others are available for getting documents signed online, which are legal. It shows that the person is that person and that they have given their consent on that, even though it is a digital signature. So digital signatures, of course, being more accepted. And of course, there'd be different aspects that you might cover in the online contract, as you've already alluded to, Rory. One of them is the geographical considerations. So if you're meeting someone face to face, they're going to be in your counselling room, or you're going to have a place where you've met up. You know exactly where they are geographically because you're there with them. When you're working online, you're not sure of where they may be. You know, they could be in a different country to yourself that works to different laws. So it would be certainly something that you would cover in your contract. And a contract, I guess, in its basic form, whether you're working face to face or online, is about thinking about your practice, thinking about all the elements of your practice and writing them down. I think this is a good exercise to do, and putting them together in a working document that is called a contract, and giving that to the client and going through that with the client in that first session. And again, it's coming right down to where we started this. It's about informing that client what is on offer. You used to say, Rory, laying out your stall. You're putting everything out. Nothing is hidden. If you have regular supervision, which you would as a qualified therapist, it should be in your contract. You should be saying, as a therapist, I go to regular supervision. I may be taking elements of our work together to my supervisor. You may then choose to say, I may not mention your name, but I will be working on, I will be taking how we're working together, because you're taking information from the room where you're working with the client and you're going and speaking to somebody else. The client has a right to know. So that is something you would cover in your contract. Other limitations in confidentiality, and I think this is a really important part. Counselling is confidential as much as it can be. But there are times when we need to break confidentiality. We are called on by legislation to break confidentiality under certain conditions. You may be working in an organization or a charity, or working in an agency where they have requirements where you would need to break confidentiality. And I'll use an example. If you're working within a school and you are seeing learners from that school, there may be certain presentations that they come to you with where you would need to break that confidentiality. It's about thinking about what are all of those reasons you would need to break confidentiality and putting them in the contract. So before the person brings their material, you're able to give them that information so they have the safety of where I can go and feel safe. It's creating a threat-free environment where the speaker or the client is free from threat and can bring the whole of themselves and know exactly where the boundaries sit within that relationship. And if you're working in a school or a new organization or a new agency, the first port of call for me is to call for their policies and procedures. And I sit and I say, where would I need to break confidentiality? Give me a list. And I put them down and I add them into my contract. Beware of contracts being handed to you, specifically as a student, you started a new agency. I'm not saying you can't use the agency contract, but make sure you've looked through it. Make sure you are happy with it, because it is the contract between you, the therapist, and the client who sits in front of you. You don't have, it's not a contract between the client and the organization or the agency. It's between you and them. So make sure you understand what's in it and that it covers all the areas that you would want a client to know in the working relationship.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I think another point that sometimes gets missed is that certainly when I'm working with student colleagues, they say it feels really incongruent, the contract. It feels, it feels, very, very different to working in a relationship. And my response has always been is that the contract informs a relationship. So if the client is clear on exactly what they're embarking on, then by definition, the relationship will develop from that. And I think that, if you are someone out there and you may be talking in your group or thinking it feels really incongruent, actually the contract is congruence. It's about being honest.
Yeah.
It's about, putting yourself there and saying, this is what I can do. This is what I can't do. This is what I can offer. This is what I can't offer. And then putting that in front of the person you're working with. It could be a peer or it may be a client, and letting them decide. And I think it's a mindset thing. It very much is about thinking of contracting as part of the therapeutic process, not an adjunct to it or something that has to be taken care of before we can get into the work. It is part of therapy. And I think if you approach it with that mindset and a thoughtfulness, that it just becomes a very natural thing. I know it is in my practice. And also just little things, not everybody can read, even at the time this is recorded in 2021, not everybody can read. So being thoughtful and saying, would you like me to explain the contract to you? And that's a way of giving the client an out. If they can't read, then they can say, yes, that would be useful. And you could read it out and then ask them, if they've got any questions. And I always in my practice on the second week, just before we start, I will say, last week we looked at the contract. Have you got any questions or anything that's unclear? And sometimes clients say, no, that's fine. And sometimes we'll say, you mentioned about, and then you can just say, okay. And the contract, thinking about the contract as something that helps the relationship and helps the process of therapy and removes blockages, it's clarity. Ooh, yeah. And that's what makes them so powerful, I think.
Yeah, I'm cheering you on here. I'm like a cheerleader in the background, Rory, because I couldn't agree more. You're hitting so many really, really valid points there. It's interesting. You kind of started that going in saying, students have mentioned in the past when we were teaching together, they would go, we were teaching a person-centered course and they would go, but the contract is active directive. I'm telling the person how it needs to be. And is that not a power imbalance? And you're 100% right. If anything, it levels the playing field. There is mutual understanding of what is going on from both sides. Nothing is hidden from this person. It is complete congruence in its truest form, in that nothing is hidden. It is all laid out, and they can ask questions about it. And you might add into the contract what the person is hoping to get out of therapy, what they're coming to you for. You might put that in, and that's a great reference point to come back when you've traveled some distance and the person may have had a breakthrough or may have had a movement. You can return back and say, when you came in, this is what you said that you were looking for. There would be responsibilities, roles and responsibilities you may add to that working agreement. What are the responsibilities of the counsellor? That I will be there at the right time, at the place that we've decided to meet, and what you would offer from a counsellor's point of view, what your modality is and how that works. You might explain it in your contract, that working agreement. And also, you might put in what the client's responsibilities are: to attend on time, to let you know at least 48 hours if they're not able to make a session, because it's respectful to both, so that there's a really clear understanding of what is expected. And it may be that you cover the contract in that first session. And although the contract may have elements of being active and directive, they are there in service of the client. And I think of it, Rory, as the client and the counsellor going to a big green field together, and the first session they spend talking to one another, putting up a fence, a big round fence, into which they then go to spend the rest of their therapeutic time. They built that fence together. They both know where that fence is. They know where the boundaries of that relationship lie. They both can see all the boundaries of that fence. And within inside that fence is the special threat-free environment, that therapeutic relationship. And it is protected by the fence that was built together by the counsellor and the client.
I love that. I absolutely love that. I love that kind of visual representation of how the contract forms that kind of protective enclave that the therapeutic relationship flourishes, develops, and works in. And you're absolutely correct, when you can use part of the contract to look back at what the client came for. I think sometimes, during when we have an assessment session, or we do a review, as it's sometimes called, a 6-week review, we can look and say, when you came, you were worried about this, but it seems, from what you've said, that isn't the case anymore. And I think that is useful for making sure therapy doesn't creep longer than it should be. That people aren't kept in therapy longer than they should be, because that's not really ethical, I don't think. And also it allows the client to see the work they've done, as a celebration. So really, really, really important. So maybe if you're listening to this, you may be able to think of contracting in a slightly different light, a different frame.
Fence building.
Yes, fence building.